Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I've been watching Tim Burton movies for most of my life. I've been able to see him become the household name and be the biggest director in the world. I watched him change from someone who's very practical effects heavy, doing like Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands and the Batman movies, and then becoming this like super heavy CG Johnny Depp obsessed guy, and now we're at this. And it's odd to see someone go from a director I really loved in the 80s and 90s to a director I didn't like as much in the 2000s, other than a few films, but for the most part didn't. And watching him try to kind of come back and do kind of different things from a style that I didn't much like. And this film isn't as CG heavy as he's been more recently, although he hasn't really done a CG heavy film since like Dark Shadows, which was about 4 years ago. Still, it's kind of surprising because this is his first like real big live action film since Dark Shadows. He did Big Eyes, but that wasn't really a major release like this one was. It's nice to see him at least attempt to go back again and do the kind of Tim Burton stuff that everyone loves. That energy, that fun, that comedic side to Tim Burton that made him so iconic and made those early films so much fun isn't in this movie at all. And this movie feels like a bizarre combination of two things that make it particularly boring and lifeless, and that is being a adaptation of a YA book that's trying to rip off things like Harry Potter and particularly X-Men, but mostly Harry Potter, and be kind of a lifeless adaptation of one of those YA novels, you know, right after that boom happened where we get Hunger Games and things like that. This adaptation feels a little too divergent for me, frankly. And then you have Tim Burton, who's kind of coming to the end of his directorial career, where he clearly doesn't have the energy or the spunk that he used to, and he's falling off as well. Even if he is trying to return to more practical effects and work on location, it obviously really isn't working at this point, and he doesn't have the stuff to get that to work as well as he used to. So you're watching a director who really isn't there as much as he should be, working with an adaptation that's clearly there more to make sequels and be approved by a studio who thought it could be a bigger hit, but not thinking about how they could have it resonate with an audience to become the larger hit they want it to. It ends up being kind of like a train wreck of two things that you wouldn't expect to make a very good movie together to make pretty much a not a very good movie. A boy named Jacob, who's played by Asia Butterfield, after his grandfather dies, and he believes that his grandfather was killed by some evil monsters, and he was always told by his grandfather about this school where children with peculiar abilities lived, and he always heard it was kind of just tall tales, and he decides to go and investigate and see if it's real, unlike another Tim Burton movie. But he decides to go there because his parents feel it will be a good healing process for him, so he goes to Wales from where he lives in Florida with his dad, played by Chris O'Dowd, doing a bad American accent, and he goes and he isn't sure where they are at first, but he finds them and realizes that they live in this house which is in a time loop where they live the same day over and over again for the rest of their lives. This one day in 1943, before a bomb hits their house and it goes all explodey. They all have peculiar powers, and he's trying to figure out how he's peculiar, and they're all guarded by Eva Green, who can turn into a bird who protects them and keeps them in this time loop because society wouldn't understand them if they got out of that time loop. But unfortunately, these evil monsters are coming after them and have followed Jacob to this time loop so that they can eat the eyeballs of these people so they can stay immortal and more human, and they have to manage not to have that happen and stay within the time loop so that society does not reject them. This was adapted by Jane Goldman, who helped write Kingsman and X-Men First Class, and I think the thing with those films is they, even though they can be lame in a certain degree, particularly First Class, it manages to work. And Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children doesn't work at all because it just doesn't have a life to the screenplay. Now, a lot of that has to do with that, like, most of the kids in this were completely miscast. If you ever wonder why Harry Potter works so well, it's because the three main leads were very well cast. And this, it just felt like they got Asia Butterfield, but even he was like not very good in this role whatsoever. He feels like such a blank slate. It doesn't feel like an interesting character. And comparing this to Harry Potter really hurts it. There's obvious comparisons there. It feels like, you know, a literary agent called a promising writer and said, make me kind of one of those YA Harry Potters and put your own spin on it. Apparently the book has kind of these vintage photos of peculiar things that he found at like flea markets and stuff that gives the book kind of its own kind of nuance about it. This movie doesn't have that at all. They kind of reference the photos in certain regard. Tim Burton doesn't seem to get the same vibe as the book, which sounds more interesting, but I didn't read it. But it feels like kind of a weaker version of something like The Golden Compass, or like one of those kind of fantasy movies where you just admire kind of the sets and the cinematography, except this film was fairly weak in terms of his cinematography, particularly for a Tim Burton film. I didn't find any of the shots particularly great for him. It did feel like he was kind of working with less pizzazz at this time, which was the point. He wanted to do a lot more practical stuff. There is CG stuff in here, but he wanted to do a lot more like on location stuff and not do, you know, the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Alice in Wonderland nonsense, which this film is much better than, but it's kind of better in such a bland way, like who gives a shit. It just doesn't have a real life to it. It doesn't have a real meat behind it to really make it a really interesting thing. You're kind of going through learning and meeting each of these characters, but so many of these characters of the Peculiar Children don't ever feel that interesting. It's like, okay, they have these cool powers and that's kind of neat, but like I don't really love any of these characters. I never really got into them as an audience member. I knew one girl could fly and stuff, another girl could shoot fire and things like that. And this is Tim Burton. Like, this is the guy who had all this personality, who had this really unique voice. It felt like that unique voice was being diminished. It felt like his auteurish voice that Tim Burton's always had. I mean, he's kind of like one of those name directors who get people to come to the theater because he directed it, like Hitchcock, you know, back in the day, or like Spielberg. And Tim Burton kind of has that, but it feels like he's not selling himself. He's selling this book. If I didn't know any better, I'd actually say, was this a work for hire job? Because it feels like that more than any other Tim Burton film I've ever seen, and I would have never thought he did something like a work for hire thing, or needed to, really. It's just kind of surprising because of that. And I wish it was cast a lot, but he used to be a lot better at casting. But Eva Green isn't even like particularly great in this. The only person I really like out of the entire cast is Samuel L. Jackson, but Samuel L. Jackson's good in like everything he's ever been in. He's the only actor who really has personality, and I kept thinking when he was on screen, I was like, man, you know, if more of these actors like had the conviction that Samuel L. Jackson did, I probably would have been more fine with this movie and liked it a lot more. It seems like Tim Burton was trying to do a return to form and go back to the Tim Burton everyone liked with this film. To me, that film was like Frankenweenie, that reminded me of the 90s Tim Burton, and I wouldn't mind a kind of return to the Tim Burton style type of a movie, but this is clearly trying to do this book, and a lot of it felt like how a lot of these YA adaptations feel, in that it's so beholden to the original that it feels kind of stagmented, and the flow feels like they have to rush through things. They have to have this character, they have to have this plot point, they don't want to make the fans angry, and by doing that they end up making a bad viewing experience for, like, you know, the other people who are going to see this that are not fans. So you end up with a lousy movie. Since I don't know the book, I don't know how beholden it was. Apparently they did change some things, but it doesn't show, you know, it doesn't flow in a way that feels like a movie that was adapted like they used to adapt books to movies. But I wish they had a little more fun with the source material, which, you know, Tim Burton has obviously done before. I was also surprised Danny Elfman didn't do the music for this, and I didn't really like the music. It felt a little Danny Elfman inspired, but it's weird to see a Tim Burton movie not have wall-to-wall score in it, and I didn't really like that at all. I didn't understand what it was trying to do with that, but it didn't feel as impactful, to be honest. It didn't feel as special. It felt like, you know, he was kind of like didn't care as much to even call his friend Danny Elfman, like it wasn't as important to him or something. But throughout his filmography, there are certain films I really like and certain films I really hate, and this is just one I'm just like, I mean, I'm not mad, I'm just more disappointed in that he just doesn't seem to really want to put a lot of energy behind it. And he was someone who used to have an amazing amount of energy. I mean, look at Mars Attacks, that guy directing this. The characters aren't interesting, the design designs honestly aren't even that interesting. He doesn't shoot it in an interesting way. And you have to really make these things come alive. He was kind of just hoping this will all just pop off the screen. And it's weird because this is a director who never would just rely on that too much. I mean, maybe Johnny Depp in a stupid hat or something, but this movie doesn't have either of those things. I don't think it has. I think it has some stupid hats. But this just feels like the bland later entry in a director's career. It's like watching a bad screenplay be directed by someone who's clearly just doing it for the studio. I don't know if that was really what happened, but it feels like just kind of a shittier B-movie workman for hire kind of direction from Tim Burton. And I'm kind of more surprised than anything that he would direct it like this. It feels more like, you know, like an average TV director than a Tim Burton. And it's like, I don't really like that. And I also don't understand, like, well, then why am I seeing a Tim Burton movie then? Like, this is just anyone's movie. And so what was initially special about him is now gone, but it's also really boring, and it was hard to even concentrate on it because this is a cast full of kids. None of them are really good actors. The characters aren't compelling. The screenplay is fairly weak, and the direction's boring. There was just like one thing after another to keep me from getting into this movie. While watching this movie, you're kind of like coming to terms with where Tim Burton is now, and it's like watching one of my heroes of movies when I was in middle school and stuff come to this. It's just like a sad kind of ironic 90s joke fulfillment kind of thing that happens far too often. And seeing this, it's more just like, oh, and now he like is this guy? I'm just sad that he was reduced to making something like this in a boring, bland way. And certainly he's made a lot of those before, but if he's gonna just like shoot this with no personality, I kind of don't understand why Tim Burton's around anymore. And kind of taking away his uniqueness as a director makes him frankly just irrelevant. And I guess that's better than watching Alice in Wonderland, but I'm kind of just still shrugging and sad and feel like nothing's ever going to get better with this guy. So if you have seen Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Again, just in case.